June 16, 1943. 8:03 a.m. Solomon Sea. A 20-millimeter cannon shell explodes through the nose of a B-17 bomber at 25,000 feet. Plexiglass shatters into 1,000 fragments. A bombardier's neck rips open. Blood sprays across the instrument panel. The pilot's left knee disintegrates, bone fragments punching through his flight suit like shrapnel through paper. 16 Japanese Zero fighters are screaming toward them at 700 miles per hour, guns blazing, tracers cutting through the Pacific sky like white-hot needles. And this bomber, this broken, cursed, abandoned wreck that the entire 5th Air Force refused to fly, is about to do something that has never been done before in the history of aerial warfare. 1 bomber, 9 men, no escort, 600 miles behind enemy lines. By the time the guns fall silent, 42 minutes later, 26 Japanese Zeros will be destroyed, or so badly damaged they'll never fly again. Every single crew member will earn one of the 2 highest military decorations in American history. 2 will receive the Medal of Honor. It will become the most decorated single air mission ever recorded. And it all started because a 24-year-old pilot from Orange, New Jersey, walked into a boneyard and fell in love with a plane that everyone else called cursed. The Pacific Nightmare. To understand what happened over Bougainville that morning, you need to understand what the Pacific looked like in early 1943. And it looked like a graveyard for American bombers. The Japanese Empire controlled a vast network of island fortresses stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Each island was ringed with anti-aircraft batteries. Each airfield was packed with Zero fighters, the most lethal interceptors in the theater. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero could climb at 3,000 feet per minute, turn inside any American fighter, and its twin 20-millimeter cannons could tear a bomber apart with a single burst. American bombers were dying at a catastrophic rate. In the 6 months before June 1943, the 5th Air Force lost 43 unescorted bombers over Japanese-held territory. 43 aircraft, hundreds of men. The survival rate for solo reconnaissance missions over enemy islands had dropped below 30%. That means 7 out of 10 crews who flew alone over Japanese territory never came back. They were shot down, burned alive, drowned in the ocean, or captured and executed. The problem was reconnaissance. The Allies were planning a massive island-hopping campaign to push the Japanese back across the Pacific. Every invasion required detailed photographs of the target, the beaches, the reefs, the defensive positions, the airfields. Those photographs could only be taken by bombers flying straight and level over enemy territory at high altitude. No evasive maneuvers, no turning, no diving. Just holding course while Japanese fighters climbed up to kill you. The photoplanes were sitting ducks. Everyone knew it. The crews knew it. The commanders knew it. But the photographs were essential. Without them, Marines would land on beaches they'd never seen, assault positions they couldn't identify, die by the hundreds in attacks that could have been planned better with proper intelligence. So command kept sending bombers out alone, and the Japanese kept shooting them down. Mission after mission, crew after crew, plane after plane disappeared over those islands and never returned. Families received telegrams. Chaplains knocked on doors. Flag-draped coffins arrived at ports across America. The Pacific Reconnaissance War was a meat grinder, and nobody had figured out how to survive it. But everything was about to change because of one man that nobody in the 5th Air Force took seriously. The misfit pilot, Captain J. Zemer, Jr., was not the kind of officer that commanders trusted with important missions. He was brilliant, everyone admitted that. An MIT engineering graduate who understood aircraft systems better than most mechanics. He could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, could calculate fuel consumption in his head, could land a B-17 in crosswinds that made other pilots abort. But Zemer had a reputation problem. He was difficult. He argued with superior officers about tactics. He modified aircraft without authorization. He refused to follow standard operating procedures that he considered inefficient or dangerous. He'd been passed over for promotion twice. 2 different squadron commanders had tried to transfer him out. One wrote in his evaluation that Zemer was technically gifted but operationally unreliable. By early 1943, Zemer was essentially a pilot without a crew and without an aircraft. The men assigned to fly with him had requested transfers. The planes he'd been given had been reassigned to other pilots. He was the odd man out sitting in the ready room at Port Moresby, New Guinea, watching other crews walk to their aircraft while he stayed behind. That's when he found the crew that nobody wanted either. They called themselves the Eager Beavers, and they were the misfits of the 65th Bombardment Squadron. Navigator Ruby Johnston, who talked too much and asked too many questions. Bombardier Joseph Sarnowski, a 28-year-old from Pennsylvania, who had been told he was going home in 3 days, but kept volunteering for missions anyway. Radio operator Johnny Abel, who had been reprimanded twice for modifying his equipment without approval. Gunners, George Kendrick, Herbert Pugh, William Vaughn, and Forrest Dillman. All of them skilled, but all of them difficult in one way or another. These were the men that other pilots didn't want on their crews. The troublemakers. The ones who asked why, instead of saying, "Yes, sir." Zemer looked at them and saw something different. He saw men who cared enough to argue, who understood their jobs well enough to know when things were being done wrong. He gathered them together and made them an offer. "Fly with me. I'll find us a plane. We'll volunteer for every mission nobody else wants. We'll prove that we belong." They said yes, every single one of them. And that decision would make history. The insane idea. Now Zemer needed an aircraft. And what he found was a joke. Sitting at the edge of the Port Moresby airfield, half buried in mud and tropical vegetation, was a B-17E bomber with the serial number 412666. Old 666. The number alone made superstitious crews avoid it. But the number was the least of its problems. Old 666 had been declared a combat loss. Previous crews had brought it back so badly damaged that maintenance had given up on it. The aircraft had been stripped of usable parts to keep other bombers flying. Engines were missing components. Instruments were dead. The hydraulic system leaked. The radio barely functioned. Other pilots walked past it and laughed. They called it cursed. They said any crew that flew it would die. Zemer looked at that wreck and saw something nobody else saw. He saw potential. His MIT engineering brain started calculating. The B-17E was a proven airframe tough, reliable, capable of absorbing enormous punishment and still flying. The problems were all fixable. What excited Zemer was not what old 666 was, but what it could be. His idea was considered insane by everyone who heard it. He wanted to transform old 666 from a standard bomber into the most heavily armed aircraft in the Pacific Theater. Standard B-17 SES carried 13.50 caliber machine guns. Zemer wanted 19. He wanted to strip 2,000 pounds of unnecessary weight, install new engines, reinforce the nose with additional guns. Add twin .50 caliber mounts in positions that normally carried single guns. His squadron commander told him it couldn't be done. The maintenance chief said he was crazy. The ordnance officer said the aircraft couldn't handle the additional ammunition weight. Zemer didn't argue. He simply started working. Every night after regular duty hours, Zemer and his crew walked out to old 666 with tools, spare parts, and a determination that bordered on obsession. They scavenged. Parts from wrecked aircraft. Engines from planes that would never fly again. Gun mounts fabricated from scrap metal. Ammunition belts assembled by hand. They rewired the electrical system. Rebuilt the hydraulics. Replaced every instrument in the cockpit. They worked by flashlight in tropical heat surrounded by mosquitoes and mud for 3 months. Nobody ordered them to do it. Nobody authorized it. Nobody believed it would work. The secret tests. When old 666 was finally ready, Zemer taxied it to the runway without permission. He didn't file a flight plan. Didn't request clearance. He simply started the engines and took off. The tower controllers watched in disbelief as the cursed bomber climbed into the sky, engines roaring, looking nothing like the wreck they remembered. The first test flight revealed something extraordinary. With 2,000 pounds of dead weight stripped away and new engines installed, Old 666 was faster than any standard B-17 in the squadron. It climbed quicker, turned tighter, handled better. And the firepower was devastating. 19.50 caliber machine guns covering every angle of approach. The nose alone carried 3 guns, where most B-17s had 1 or none. The waist positions had twin mounts instead of singles. The ball turret, the tail, the top turret, all upgraded, all carrying maximum ammunition loads. Zemer flew test after test. His crew practiced gunnery runs against towed targets. The results were staggering. Old 666 could put out more rounds per minute than a standard B-17 by nearly 50%. The cone of fire from the nose alone could shred a fighter at 500 yards. Word spread through the squadron quietly. The misfits had built something special. Other crews started paying attention. A few mechanics volunteered to help with final adjustments. The maintenance chief, who had called Zemer crazy, walked around Old 666, inspected every modification, and admitted he was impressed. Zemer's crew started volunteering for missions. The dangerous ones. The ones that other crews found excuses to avoid. Solo reconnaissance over enemy islands. Long-range patrols over open ocean. Photo mapping runs that required holding straight and level over Japanese airfields. They flew one mission, came back, flew another, came back. Each time they encountered enemy fighters. Each time, Old 666's massive firepower drove them off. The cursed bomber was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a legend. The crew logged 17 successful missions in Old 666 without a single loss. 17 times they flew into enemy territory. 17 times they came home. The statistics were remarkable. No other solo reconnaissance crew in the 5th Air Force had survived more than 5 missions. Zemer's crew had tripled that number and showed no signs of stopping. But command had noticed, and they had a mission that nobody else would take. A mission so dangerous that 3 different crews had already refused it. A mission that intelligence officers privately called suicidal. Photograph Bougainville. The suicide mission. The request came directly from the Marines. The 3rd Marine Division was planning an invasion of Bougainville for November 1943. They needed detailed mapping photographs of Empress Augusta Bay on the western coastline. Every beach, every reef, every approach route, every defensive position. Without those photos, the invasion would go in blind. Thousands of Marines would land on beaches they couldn't see, assault positions they hadn't mapped, die in numbers that proper intelligence could have prevented. But Bougainville was a fortress. The Japanese had 6 operational airfields on the island and surrounding waters. Hundreds of Zero fighters were stationed within scramble distance. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed every strategic point. And intelligence had just added a last-minute requirement: photograph Buka Airfield on the small island north of Bougainville first. Increased Japanese activity. Possible reinforcement buildup. That meant flying over 2 separate enemy positions, holding straight and level for photo runs over both with no escort. The P-38 fighters that normally provided cover didn't have the range to reach Bougainville. The bomber would be alone for the entire 1,200-mile round trip. 600 miles behind enemy lines. Hours of flight time over open ocean and enemy territory. 3 crews heard the briefing and declined. They didn't refuse, exactly, that would be insubordination. They simply presented medical issues, mechanical problems, scheduling conflicts. Everyone understood. Nobody blamed them. A 30% survival rate meant certain death for somebody, and nobody wanted to be that somebody. Zemer heard about the mission and walked into the operations tent. He didn't ask for details. He didn't negotiate conditions. He said 5 words. "My crew will take it." The operations officer looked at him, looked at the mission folder, looked back at Zemer. "You understand what this is, Captain Solo, no escort 2 photo runs over heavily defended targets 1,200 miles round trip." Zemer nodded. "We'll take off at 0400. That night the crew gathered around Old 666. Sarnosky was there, the bombardier who was supposed to fly home to Pennsylvania in 3 days. His bags were packed. His orders were signed. His wife Marie was expecting him. He had every reason in the world to walk away to let someone else take his position to go home alive. He didn't. He loaded his cameras, checked his guns, and told Zemer he was ready. He never explained why. Maybe he felt he owed the crew one more mission. Maybe he couldn't let them fly without an experienced bombardier. Maybe he simply couldn't walk away from men who had become his brothers. Whatever his reason, it was the last decision Joseph Sarnosky would ever make. At 4 a.m., on June 16, 1943, 0666, lifted off from Port Moresby and turned northeast into the darkness. 9 men. 1 bomber. 1,200 miles of ocean and enemy territory ahead of them. None of them knew that in 4 hours they would fight the most savage air battle of the Pacific War. None of them knew that before the morning was over, one of them would be dead, and the rest would be covered in blood. But all of them knew one thing. They were not coming back without those photographs. What happened next over the skies of Bougainville would become the single most decorated air combat mission in American military history. But the battle that awaited them was far worse than anything command had predicted. Far worse than anything the crew had imagined. Far worse than anything the Japanese expected. In Part 2, the sky over Buka explodes. 16 Zeros climb toward Old 666. And Joseph Sarnosky, with 3 days left before going home, makes a choice that will echo through history forever. In Part 1, a misfit pilot named J. Zemer rebuilt a cursed bomber from the boneyard, assembled a crew of rejects, and mounted 19 machine guns on an aircraft that the entire 5th Air Force had left to rot. They flew 17 successful missions that nobody else would take. Then Command handed them the worst assignment in the Pacific, a solo photo-reconnaissance run over Bougainville, with no fighter escort, 1,200 miles round trip, and a survival rate that made grown men refuse to fly. Old 666 lifted off at 4 a.m. on June 16, 1943, carrying 9 men into darkness. But getting to Bougainville was only half the problem. What waited for them over Buka Island would test every modification, every bullet, every ounce of courage that Zemer's crew had built over 3 months of midnight labor. Because the Japanese had been watching. They knew an American reconnaissance plane was coming, and they had 16 Zero fighters fueled, armed, and waiting on the airstrip below. The odds of surviving a 16-to-1 aerial engagement in 1943 were mathematically 0. No bomber in the Pacific Theater had ever faced those numbers alone and lived to report it. And here is where everything Zemer feared came true, worse than the mission briefing, worse than the intelligence estimates, worse than the nightmares that kept Bombardier Joseph Sarnosky awake the night before, despite knowing his ticket home was signed and sitting in his footlocker. Old 666 reached Bougainville's airspace at 7:40 a.m. 3 hours and 40 minutes of flying through darkness, then dawn, then blinding Pacific sunlight over an ocean so blue it looked painted. The crew was alert. Every gunner at his station. Every ammunition belt loaded. Every gun charged and ready. But when they arrived over the target area for the Empress Augusta Bay mapping run, the sun was too low. The angle was wrong. Shadows covered the beaches. The photographs would be useless. Zemer called the crew on the intercom. They had a choice. Circle over the ocean for 30 minutes and wait for better light, or fly north to Buka Island first and photograph the airfield that intelligence had flagged for increased Japanese activity. Wait safely, or fly directly over a known enemy fighter base. They voted. 9 men. The decision was unanimous. Photograph Buka first. Get it done. Come back for Empress Augusta Bay when the light improved. It was the most dangerous choice they could have made, and it was exactly what the Japanese were hoping for. Old 666 turned north. The bomber climbed to 25,000 feet, the maximum altitude where the mapping cameras could produce usable photographs. At that height, the air temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Frost formed on the inside of the plexiglass windows. The crew breathed through rubber oxygen masks connected to yellow tanks behind the cockpit. Without that oxygen, unconsciousness would come in 90 seconds. Death in 4 minutes. Sarnowski activated the cameras in the nose. The bombardier's position was the most exposed spot on the entire aircraft. A bubble of plexiglass jutting forward from the fuselage, surrounded by nothing but air and sky. He could see the ocean 25,000 feet below through the floor. He could see the horizon curving away in every direction. And at 8:01 a.m., he could see Buka Island sliding into view beneath them. Small, green, ringed with white coral beaches, and covered with aircraft. The cameras started clicking. Sarnowski adjusted the intervalometer, the device that controlled the spacing between photographs. Each image overlapped the previous one by 60%, creating a continuous mosaic that intelligence officers could assemble into a complete map. The process required absolute precision. The bomber had to fly straight and level at a constant speed and altitude. No turns, no banks, no evasive maneuvers of any kind. For the next 2 minutes, Old 666 would be flying in a perfectly predictable straight line, directly over a Japanese airfield. A target so easy that even a training pilot could hit it. Navigator Ruby Johnston spotted them first. Dust clouds on the runway below. Aircraft moving. He counted them through his binoculars. 4, 8, 12. 16 fighters scrambling from the airstrip engines, already running canopies, closing wheels, lifting off the coral runway one after another in rapid succession. 16 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros fighters, climbing at 3,000 feet per minute. They would reach Old 666's altitude in approximately 8 minutes. Johnston keyed his intercom. His voice was steady but urgent. 16 fighters scrambling from Buka, climbing fast, 8 minutes to intercept. Zemer heard the report. 16 fighters. 1 bomber. No escort. 600 miles from the nearest friendly airfield. The mathematics of survival collapsed to a single point. He had 2 options. Abort the photo run, immediately dive for the ocean run for home, and pray the Zeros couldn't catch them. Or hold course for 2 more minutes, complete the photographs that the Marines needed, and fight. Zemer held course. The cameras kept running. 120 seconds. That was all he needed. 2 minutes of straight and level flight over an island full of men who wanted to kill him. 2 minutes that would feel like 2 hours. The Zeros climbed through 20,000 feet. Then 22,000. They spread into attack formation. As they ascended, 5 fighters in the lead element, the rest stacking behind in waves. The flight leader studied the American bomber above him. Single B-17. No escorts visible. Standard reconnaissance configuration. Easy kill. He didn't know about the 19 guns. At 25,000 feet, the first 5 Zeros leveled off and accelerated. They came in from directly ahead, a frontal attack aimed at the cockpit and nose. It was the standard Japanese tactic against bombers. Kill the pilot, kill the bombardier, and the aircraft becomes a coffin falling from the sky. Most B-17s in the Pacific carried minimal armament in the nose. 1 gun, maybe 2. Not enough to stop a determined fighter attack. Old 666 carried 3 50 caliber guns in the nose. Twin guns that Sarnowski could aim and fire, plus a fixed gun that Zemer could trigger from the cockpit. 3 streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds converging on a single point in space, a wall of lead that no fighter pilot in the world expected to fly into. The 5 Zeros closed at a combined speed of 700 miles per hour. At 600 yards, they opened fire. Their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns sent tracers streaming toward Old 666. Sarnowski watched them come, bright streaks against the blue sky, curving slightly, reaching for his position. He gripped the twin gun handles, swung them toward the lead Zero. The fighter filled his gun sight, growing larger every fraction of a second. He fired. Zemer fired. 350 caliber guns roared simultaneously. The sound inside the nose was deafening, a physical force that shook Sarnowski's entire body. Tracers from all three guns converged on the lead Zero at 400 yards. The fighter's engine exploded. The cowling blew apart. Flames erupted from the shattered cylinders. The Zero rolled inverted, trailed fire and smoke, and fell away toward the ocean 5 miles below. First blood. 4 seconds into the engagement. 1 Zero destroyed. The other 4 fighters kept coming. They hadn't expected the nose armament, but they were committed now. At 300 yards, 20mm shells slammed into old 6.66's nose. The plexiglass shattered. Fragments blew inward like a grenade. One shell exploded directly in front of Sarnowski. The blast threw him backward off his seat. Shrapnel tore into his neck, ripped open his side. Blood poured from wounds that would have killed most men instantly. In the cockpit, shells punched through the floor. Shrapnel erupted upward into Zemer's legs. His left knee disintegrated. The kneecap shattered. Bone fragments separated above and below the joint. A hole the size of a fist opened in his thigh. His right wrist was sliced to the tendon. Blood filled his left boot within seconds. The pain was beyond description, a white-hot fire that consumed his entire lower body. The first wave flashed past. 12 seconds from first shot to last. 1 Zero destroyed. 1 bombardier mortally wounded. 1 pilot with both legs shattered. 15 fighters still climbing below. Navigator Johnston crawled forward through the narrow catwalk connecting the cockpit to the nose. He found Sarnowski on the floor beneath the guns. Blood pooled around him on the cold metal. The bombardier's neck wound pulsed red with every heartbeat. Johnston pressed his hand against the gash, tried to stem the flow. Sarnowski pushed him away, pointed at the guns, pointed at the sky above. 8 more Zeros were diving from 26,000 feet. They'd watched the first attack, learned from it. This time they split into 2 groups, 4 from above, 4 from below. Bracket attack, designed to overwhelm the bomber's defenses from 2 directions simultaneously. Sarnowski dragged himself back to the gun position. Blood soaked his flight suit from collar to waist. His hands shook. His vision blurred. He blinked, forced his eyes to focus, gripped the twin 50 caliber handles. The lead Zero grew in his gun sight. 600 yards, 500, 400. He fired. The twin 50s roared. Tracers walked up the Zero's nose and through the canopy. Glass and metal fragments spiraled away. The fighter rolled right, smoking, dying. Sarnowski shifted aim, found the second fighter, fired again. Rounds punched through the engine cowling. The propeller seized. The Zero fell away powerless. 2 more kills. With a torn neck. With a shredded side. With his life pumping out of him onto the floor of a bomber that everyone had called cursed. Joseph Sarnowski, 3 days from going home to his wife Marie in Pennsylvania, was fighting with a fury that defied every medical reality. A dying man destroying enemy fighters through pure will and rage and love for the 8 men behind him, who were counting on those nose guns to keep them alive. Below the fuselage, ball turret gunner Forrest Dillman engaged the 4 Zeros attacking from underneath. His twin 50s tracked the lead fighter, climbing straight up toward old 6.66's belly. He opened fire at 400 yards. Rounds walked up the Zero's underside. The fuel tank erupted. An orange fireball blossomed at 18,000 feet. The other 3 scattered, diving away from the unexpected resistance. The cameras clicked off. Mapping complete. Zemer shoved the control yoke forward with blood-slicked hands. Old 6.66's nose dropped into a dive. The altimeter unwound. 24,000. 22,000. 20,000. The crew's personal oxygen bottles were nearly empty. At 25,000 feet without oxygen, hypoxia would set in within minutes. Confusion, loss of coordination, unconsciousness, death. But the Zeros followed them down. 13 fighters still operational, regrouping, planning their next attack. The Japanese flight leader changed tactics. No more frontal assaults against that devastating nose armament. Attack the sides, the waist positions. Most B-17s carried single guns there. Vulnerable. He didn't know old 6.66 had twin 50s in both waist positions. 6 Zeros came from the right, 7 from the left. A split attack designed to overwhelm the gunners, force them to choose which side to defend. Staff Sergeant George Kendrick took the right. Sergeant Herbert Pugh took the left. They'd flown together for 8 months. They didn't need words. They knew. Kendrick opened fire at 500 yards. His first burst caught the lead Zero's wing root. Fuel sprayed. The fighter rolled away, trailing fire. He shifted to the second. Missed. The Zero was jinking. He led the target. Fired again. Rounds walked across the fuselage. Cockpit glass shattered. The fighter snapped left out of control. 2 down on the right. 4 still coming. On the left, Pugh held his fire. Let the lead Zero close. Let it commit. At 300 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The Zero flew directly through his stream of tracers. Engine smoking, it pulled up and vanished. Tail gunner William Vaughn engaged 4 more from the rear. His twin 50s caught the lead Zero across the engine at point-blank range. Smoke poured. It stalled and fell away, spinning. 42 minutes. That's how long the battle lasted. 42 minutes of continuous aerial combat at altitudes ranging from 25,000 to 15,000 feet. When the Japanese fighters finally broke off at 8:45 a.m., they had lost aircraft confirmed destroyed, with additional fighters so badly damaged they would never fly combat again. 26 Zeros eliminated by a single bomber. Their ammunition was depleted. Their fuel gauges showed critical levels. The flight leader waggled his wings, the signal to disengage, and the surviving fighters turned northeast toward Buka. Old 666 limped southwest alone over open ocean. 1 engine dead. Hydraulics leaking. Radio destroyed. Nose plexiglass gone, wind screaming through the opening at 200 miles per hour. 187 bullet holes in the fuselage. 5 20mm cannon strikes. And beneath the catwalk in the nose, covered with a crew member's jacket, lay the body of Joseph Sarnosky. The bombardier had kept firing for 4 minutes after the wound that killed him. 4 minutes of combat with his neck torn open and his side ripped apart. He'd destroyed enemy fighters while his heart pumped the last of his blood onto the floor of the cursed bomber he'd volunteered to fly 3 days before going home. Johnston had checked for a pulse after the second wave, found none. Sarnosky's heart had stopped while his hands were still on the guns. Johnston pulled the body away, took the bombardier's position, manned the guns himself. Old 666 needed every gunner for the 600-mile flight home. Zemer slumped in the pilot's seat. His left leg was destroyed. His right wrist bled steadily. His flight suit was soaked red from waist to boots. Co-pilot John Britton took the controls. The crew packed Zemer's wounds with sulfa powder and gauze, wrapped them tight, slowed the bleeding. That was all they could do. He needed a surgeon. Blood transfusions, hours of surgery. And Port Moresby was still 500 miles southwest across the Solomon Sea, over the Owen Stanley Mountains, through weather that was closing in fast. Old 666 was losing altitude. 3 engines couldn't maintain 15,000 feet with the damage. Number 1 was running hot temperature gauge in the red oil pressure fluctuating. If that engine failed, they'd have 2. Not enough to clear the 7,000-foot mountains between them and home. A jungle crash meant death for everyone. Britain flew on instruments through clouds, rain and lightning. The bomber descended through 9,000 feet, with mountains invisible somewhere ahead. When they broke through the clouds, jagged peaks rose on both sides, higher than the aircraft. Britain banked into a valley, followed it southwest, searching for a pass. The altimeter kept dropping. 8,000 feet. Old 666 struggled upward at 700 feet per minute, barely enough. They cleared the final ridge by 300 feet. Trees flashed below. Port Moresby appeared ahead. Britain couldn't radio the tower. Dead radio. He dropped the gear, deployed partial flaps, came in at 140 miles per hour, 30 too fast. The wheels touched, bounced, touched, again, held. He reversed propellers, braked hard. Old 666 stopped with 200 feet of runway remaining. The ground crew pulled Zemer from the cockpit on a stretcher. His face was gray. No visible movement. The crew chief told the medics, "Get the pilot out last. He's dead." Britain grabbed the lead medic's arm. "He's not dead. Check him." They found a pulse. Weak. Thread-like. Barely there. They rushed him to surgery. The doctors gave him 1 chance in 10. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. Because the photographs that old 666 carried the images that Sarnowski died for, that Zemer bled, for that 9 men, fought 16 fighters, to protect those photographs, were about to change everything. Intelligence officers developed the film within hours, and what they found on that film would not only justify every bullet hole in old 666's fuselage, it would reshape the entire Allied strategy for the Solomon Islands campaign. The question was no longer whether Zemer's crew had survived. The question was whether what they discovered over Buka would arrive in time to save the thousands of Marines preparing to invade Bougainville. Because the Japanese were building something on that island, something the Allies hadn't expected, something that if left unchecked would turn the November invasion into a massacre. And the clock was already ticking. In Part 3, the photographs reveal a secret that sends shockwaves through Allied command. The Marines prepare for the bloodiest landing of the Pacific campaign, and the legacy of old 666 transforms from a single mission into a weapon that will alter the course of the war itself. The battle in the sky was over. The battle on the ground was about to begin. In Part 1, a misfit pilot named J. Zemer rebuilt a cursed bomber from a boneyard and armed it with 19 machine guns. In Part 2, that bomber fought 16 Japanese Zero fighters alone over Buka Island for 42 minutes, destroyed or crippled 26 enemy aircraft, and limped home with a dead bombardier, a dying pilot, and 187 bullet holes in its fuselage. The most savage aerial engagement any single bomber had ever survived. But the battle in the sky was only half the story. Because strapped inside old 666's shattered nose behind the blood and the spent brass casings and the body of Joseph Sarnowski sat 2 cameras. And the film inside those cameras was about to send shockwaves through every level of Allied command in the Pacific. Within 6 hours of old 666's landing at Port Moresby, intelligence officers had developed every frame. What they found made them pick up the phone and call General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters directly. No chain of command, no intermediaries. The photographs were that important, and the news was that bad. The question was no longer whether old 666's mission had been worth it. The question was whether the Allies could react fast enough to prevent a disaster that nobody had seen coming. The Japanese respond. The photographs of Buka airfield revealed something that Allied intelligence had completely missed. The Japanese weren't just reinforcing their positions on Bougainville, they were expanding. 16 aircraft visible on the ground at Buka confirmed a major buildup, but the coastal mapping photos of Empress Augusta Bay told an even more alarming story. New gun emplacements, reinforced bunker positions along the tree line, landing obstacles being constructed on the beaches, trench networks extending inland for hundreds of yards. The Japanese 17th Army, under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, was preparing for exactly the invasion that the Marines were planning. They knew it was coming. They were getting ready. Intelligence analysts estimated that Japanese defensive strength on western Bougainville had increased by 40% since the last available photographs taken 3 months earlier by a reconnaissance plane that barely escaped with its crew alive. 3 months of unchecked Japanese construction. 3 months of fortification that the Allies knew nothing about until Sarnowski's cameras captured it. The implications were immediate and terrifying. The original invasion plan for Empress Augusta Bay assumed light to moderate beach defenses. The 3rd Marine Division was scheduled to land 14,000 men in the first wave. If those Marines hit fortified beaches with heavy gun emplacements and reinforced bunker networks that they didn't know existed, the casualties would be catastrophic. Hundreds dead in the first hour, maybe thousands. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, the loss of 26 fighters over Buka sent its own shockwaves through the chain of command. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka at Rabaul received the combat reports within hours. A single American bomber had destroyed or damaged 26 of his fighters. 1 aircraft. The pilots who survived the engagement reported that the bomber carried unprecedented firepower guns in positions where no B-17 had ever mounted them before. The nose alone had been a death trap. Kusaka ordered an immediate tactical review. If the Americans were modifying their bombers with this kind of armament, standard interception procedures were obsolete. Frontal attacks against B-17s, the tactic that Japanese fighter pilots had used successfully for 18 months, were suddenly suicidal. He issued new standing orders. No more head-on passes against American heavy bombers. Attack from the sides and rear only. Use altitude advantage. Never engage a lone bomber that appears to be flying without escort. It might be a trap. The irony was devastating. Old 666 was 1 aircraft. 1 modification. 1 crew's obsessive project built from scrapyard parts and midnight labor. But the Japanese response treated it as evidence of a systematic American upgrade program. They assumed every B-17 might now carry 19 guns. They changed tactics across the entire theater based on a single engagement. Fear multiplied what 1 bomber had accomplished into a strategic advantage that affected hundreds of missions flown by aircraft that carried nothing more than standard armament. But the Japanese fighter losses were only one piece of the puzzle. The real crisis was unfolding in Allied planning rooms, where the photographs from Old 666 were forcing commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. The November invasion plan was wrong, and they had less than 5 months to fix it. The crisis within. The intelligence shakeup triggered by Old 666's photographs exposed a failure that nobody wanted to acknowledge. For months, Allied planners had been building the Bougainville invasion strategy on outdated information. The last reliable photographs of Empress Augusta Bay were 90 days old. 90 days during which the Japanese had transformed light beach positions into hardened defensive networks. The question that nobody wanted to ask out loud was simple and brutal. How many other targets across the Pacific were the Allies planning to invade based on photographs that were weeks or months out of date? How many other beaches had been fortified while reconnaissance planes couldn't get through to photograph them? The answer was uncomfortable. Almost all of them. The reconnaissance gap was systemic. Solo bombers flying over Japanese islands had a survival rate below 30%. Crews refused the missions. Commanders stopped ordering them. And without current photographs, invasion plans were being built on guesswork and hope. Some officers blamed Zimmer's approach. They argued that arming reconnaissance bombers to the teeth and encouraging volunteer crews to fly suicide missions was reckless, unsustainable, and set a dangerous precedent. One staff colonel at 5th Air Force Headquarters called it cowboy tactics that got 1 man killed and another crippled. He recommended against any further modifications to reconnaissance aircraft. Others saw it differently. Brigadier General Kenneth Walker, who had been advocating for better armed reconnaissance platforms for months before his own death in a bombing raid over Rabaul in January 1943, had written memos arguing that the survival rate problem was a firepower problem. Standard B-17s couldn't defend themselves against concentrated fighter attacks. Give them more guns, strip unnecessary weight, let aggressive crews fly them, and the mathematics of survival changed. Old 666 had proved Walker right. 1 heavily armed bomber had survived odds that should have been impossible. The crew had completed their photo mission, fought off 16 fighters, and brought home intelligence that was already reshaping invasion planning. The debate raged through July and August 1943. Meanwhile, the clock kept ticking toward November. The Marines needed updated plans. Updated plans needed updated photographs. Updated photographs needed aircraft that could survive the mission. And then the orders came down. Not from the staff colonels who wanted to play it safe. From MacArthur's headquarters directly. Modify more reconnaissance bombers. Increase armament. Recruit volunteer crews. Get current photographs of every invasion target in the Solomon Islands chain. Old 666 had been one aircraft. Now the concept was becoming doctrine. November 1st, 1943. Empress Augusta Bay. Dawn. The Solomon Sea is flat and gray. A light mist hangs over the water. 14,000 Marines of the 3rd Marine Division crouch in landing craft that pitch and roll in the gentle swell. They've been briefed. They've studied the maps. They've memorized the photographs. Every beach, every reef, every approach route, every defensive position, all of it captured by old 666's cameras 4.5 months earlier. The photographs changed everything. Where the original plan called for a direct frontal assault on the most accessible beaches, the updated plan used Sarnowski's images to identify weaker points in the Japanese defenses. Gaps in the bunker network. Blind spots in the gun emplacement coverage. Sections of beach where the landing obstacles were incomplete or poorly positioned. The Marines weren't going in blind anymore. They were going in with a map drawn in a dead bombardier's blood. At 7:26 a.m., the first wave hits the beach. Cape Torokina. The landing craft grind onto volcanic sand. Ramps drop. Marines charge forward into waist-deep surf. Japanese machine guns open fire from the tree line. Mortar rounds explode in the shallows. Men fall. The water turns pink, but the Marines know where the guns are. The photographs showed them. Fire teams sprint toward pre-identified positions. Flanking routes that were invisible on older maps are clear on Sarnowski's images. Squad leaders direct their men around strongpoints instead of through them. Bangalore torpedoes blow gaps in wire obstacles that the photographs had pinpointed. The Japanese defenders fight hard. They always do. Bunkers that were identified in the photographs absorb naval gunfire and keep shooting. But the Marines have planned for this. Demolition teams know exactly which bunkers to hit. They know the approaches. They know the blind spots. They move with a precision that is only possible because 9 men in a cursed bomber flew straight and level over this coastline while 16 fighters tried to kill them. By noon, the beachhead is established. 12,000 Marines are ashore. The perimeter extends 600 yards inland. Japanese counterattacks hit the line at 1:30 p.m. and are repulsed. More counterattacks at 3 p.m. Repulsed again. By nightfall, the 3rd Marine Division holds a beachhead, 1 mile wide and half a mile deep. The casualty figures tell the story. The original invasion plan, based on outdated intelligence, projected first-day casualties of 15 to 20%. That meant 200 to 2,800 Marines killed or wounded on D-Day alone. The actual first-day casualties at Cape Torokina were 78 killed and 104 wounded. Total 182. Let that number sink in. 182 casualties instead of a projected 2,800. 87% fewer men killed or wounded than the original plan anticipated. Because the invasion used photographs taken by a dying bombardier and a bleeding pilot who held their aircraft steady while their world exploded around them. The Marines secured the beachhead within 72 hours. By November 4th, engineers were building an airfield on the captured ground. By mid-November, American fighters were operating from Bougainville itself, within striking distance of Rabaul, the greatest Japanese fortress in the South Pacific. Japanese General Hyakutake launched a massive counteroffensive in March 1944 with 15,000 troops. It failed. The American positions chosen and fortified, based on detailed knowledge of the terrain from old 666's photographs, held against everything the Japanese threw at them. By the end of the Bougainville campaign, Japanese losses exceeded 18,000 killed. American losses were a fraction of that number. The intelligence that old 666 brought home didn't just save lives on the beach at Cape Torokina. It shaped every subsequent decision about the Bougainville campaign. Where to build airfields, where to establish supply depots, where to position artillery, where to expect counterattacks. Every choice flowed from photographs taken at 25,000 feet by cameras operated by a man who was bleeding to death. Word of the Bougainville success spread through the Pacific Command structure like wildfire. The reconnaissance doctrine that old 666 had pioneered heavily armed bombers flown by volunteer crews was adopted across multiple air forces. More aircraft were modified. More crews volunteered. The survival rate for reconnaissance missions, which had stood below 30% before Zemer's flight, climbed steadily as better armed aircraft replaced the vulnerable standard configurations. Recognition. The military honors came swiftly and in unprecedented numbers. On December 17, 1943, Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation described a bombardier who continued to fight with mortal wounds, who destroyed enemy aircraft while his life drained away, who chose to man his guns instead of accepting aid that might have saved him. His widow Marie received the medal at a ceremony in Pennsylvania. She held it, looked at it, then gave it to Sarnowski's parents. They placed it in a glass case next to his silver star, next to his air medal, next to the photograph of their son in his uniform, smiling alive, 28 years old, forever. On January 16, 1944, Captain J. Zemer received the Medal of Honor at Walter Reed Hospital. He was still in a wheelchair, still recovering from the 7th surgery on his left leg. His mother cried. His father saluted. Zemer held the medal and said nothing. What could he say? The man who deserved to stand beside him was in a grave in Pennsylvania. The other 7 crew members, Britton Johnston, Abel Kendrick, Pugh, Vaughn, and Dillman, each received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States, 7 DSCs, and 2 Medals of Honor for a single mission. It remains the most highly decorated single air combat action in American military history. No crew before or since has ever received that concentration of valor awards for one flight. 2 Medals of Honor, 7 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Purple Hearts, 9 men. 1 cursed bomber. 42 minutes over Buka that changed the course of a campaign and saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives on the beaches of Bougainville. But this is where the story usually ends in the history books. The medals, the statistics, the military records filed away in archives. What the books don't tell you is what happened after. What happened to the pilot who nearly died? What happened to the bomber that everyone called cursed? What happened to the families who received telegrams and medals instead of the men they loved? Because the final chapter of Old 666's story is not about war. It's about what war does to the men who survive it. And it's about a question that J. Zemer carried for 64 years until the day he died. A question that has no answer. A question that haunts every soldier who lives when someone beside him doesn't. In Part 4, we follow Zemer from a hospital bed to Arlington National Cemetery. We learn what became of old 666. And we discover the one thing about this story that the Medal of Honor could never fix. The war story is over. The human story is just beginning. A misfit pilot rebuilt a cursed bomber from a boneyard. A crew of rejects armed it with 19 machine guns. They flew alone into the teeth of 16 Japanese fighters over Buka Island, fought for 42 minutes, destroyed or crippled 26 Zeros, and brought home photographs that saved hundreds of Marines on the beaches of Bougainville. 2 Medals of Honor, 7 Distinguished Service Crosses, the most decorated single air mission in American history. But medals are metal. They hang on walls and sit in glass cases and collect dust. The real story of old 666 didn't end when the guns fell silent over the Solomon Sea. It didn't end when the Marines stormed Cape Torokina. It didn't end when the war itself ground to a halt in August 1945. The real story lived inside the men who survived, and it followed them home. Because victory has a price that no citation can describe, and Jay Zemer paid it for 64 years. The man who almost died. Zemer spent 15 months in hospitals, 7 surgeries on his left leg, 3 on his right wrist. The knee that a 20mm shell had destroyed never healed properly. Doctors rebuilt it with wire and pins and bone grafts pieced together. What shrapnel had torn apart gave him back the ability to walk. But walking and walking right are different things. Zemer limped for the rest of his life, every step a reminder, every staircase a negotiation with pain. Physical therapy lasted a year. Learning to grip a pencil again with a wrist that had been sliced to the tendon. Learning to bend a knee that was more metal than bone. Learning to stand without the room spinning from months of lying flat. The doctors told him he would never fly again. His left leg couldn't operate a rudder pedal. His right hand couldn't grip a control yoke for more than a few minutes without cramping. He proved them wrong. He flew again. Not combat, not bombers, but small civilian aircraft in the years after the war. Quietly. Alone. As if he needed to prove to himself that the sky hadn't beaten him. Zemer returned to MIT after the war and earned a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. The pilot who had understood aircraft systems better than most mechanics became an engineer who designed them. He worked in the aerospace industry for 30 years, contributed to projects that pushed the boundaries of flight beyond anything his B-17 could have imagined. He married, had children, built a life that looked from the outside complete and successful. He retired to Boothbay Harbor, Maine, the place where he'd spent summers as a child. He built boats, he sailed, he watched the ocean and said very little about the war. His children knew he had medals. They knew about old 666 in the vague way that children know about their parents' pasts as stories that happened to someone who existed before they did. Zemer didn't talk about Bucha. Didn't talk about the 42 minutes. Didn't talk about Joseph Sarnosky. Some silences speak louder than any words. Zemer carried his silence for 6 decades. He died on March 22, 2007, age 88. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, with full military honors. Section 34. Grave, 809. The headstone reads, Lieutenant Colonel J. Zemer, Jr. Medal of Honor. Old, 666. 4 words that contain an entire world of blood and fire and loss. But the legacy that Zemer left behind wasn't carved in stone. It was written in doctrine. The doctrine that outlived the war. Old, 666, proved something that military planners had debated for years. A single aircraft properly armed and crewed by men who understood their machine could survive odds that conventional wisdom called impossible. The concept of the heavily armed reconnaissance platform, born in a New Guinea boneyard from scrap parts and stubbornness, didn't die with the war. It evolved. The principle that Zemer pioneered that reconnaissance aircraft needed to fight their way to the target and fight their way home shaped every generation of military surveillance that followed. In Korea, RF-86 Sabres carried cameras and guns. In Vietnam, RF-4 Sea Phantoms flew photo missions with full combat capability. The modern U-2 and Global Hawk programs owe their philosophical DNA to the same question Zemer asked in 1943. How do you get photographs of places where the enemy doesn't want you to look? The answer hasn't changed in 80 years. You build the best machine you can. You crew it with people who refuse to quit. And you accept that some missions require courage that no amount of technology can replace. Across the Pacific War alone, the reconnaissance doctrine changes that old 666 contributed to more accurate invasion planning at Tarawa Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Intelligence officers estimated that improved pre-invasion photography gathered by better armed and more survivable aircraft reduced amphibious assault casualties by an average of 12 to 15% across the final 2 years of the Pacific Campaign. 12% of tens of thousands of Marines hitting dozens of beaches across thousands of miles of ocean. The mathematics of lives saved is staggering. But the biggest lesson from old 666 was never about cameras or guns or aircraft modifications. The real lesson. It was about what happens when you let the misfits try. Zemer was a pilot that nobody wanted. His crew were the men that other pilots rejected. Old 666 was an aircraft that the entire Air Force had abandoned. Every component of this story was built from pieces that the system had thrown away. And together, those rejected pieces accomplished what no standard unit with standard equipment and standard procedures had ever managed. The military, like every large institution, rewards conformity. Follow orders. Don't question procedures. Don't modify equipment without authorization. Don't volunteer for missions above your grade. The system is designed to produce consistent, predictable results. And most of the time that system works. But there are moments when consistent and predictable aren't enough. Moments when the mission requires something that doesn't exist in any manual. Those are the moments when misfits matter. The engineer who sees potential in a wrecked airframe. The bombardier who volunteers for one more mission when his ticket home is already signed. The gunners who spend their off hours installing weapons that nobody authorized. History is full of these moments. Percy Spencer, a man with no college degree, accidentally discovered microwave cooking while working on military radar. Barnes Wallis was told his bouncing bomb idea was insane before it destroyed German dams. Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet officer who ignored protocol, may have single-handedly prevented nuclear war by trusting his instincts over his instruments. Innovation doesn't come from the center of the system. It comes from the edges, from the people who see things differently because they've never been taught to see them the standard way. The detail nobody knows. There is one final piece of this story. Old 666 was repaired after the mission. New engines, patched bullet holes, replacement plexiglass in the nose. The bomber returned to service and flew 18 more combat missions before being retired in March 1944. It was flown back to the United States, used as a training aircraft, and finally scrapped in August 1945 when the war ended. But the crews who flew Old 666 in those final 18 missions reported something that never made it into any official record. They said the patches over the bullet holes were visible throughout the aircraft. Aluminum squares riveted over ragged holes, dozens of them covering every surface. And on the floor of the cockpit beneath the pilot's seat, there was a stain that no amount of cleaning could remove. A dark brown stain that maintenance crews scrubbed and never fully erased. Zemer's blood, soaked into the metal floor of the cockpit during 8 hours of flight with shattered legs. Permanent. Indelible. A mark that the cursed bomber carried to the scrapyard. The crews who flew Old 666 after Zemer said they never forgot that stain was beneath them. They said it made them fly better, more carefully, more courageously, as if the bomber itself remembered what had happened over Buka and demanded that everyone who sat in that cockpit live up to it. Final words. From a rejected pilot with an idea that everyone called insane to the most decorated air mission in American military history. J. Zemer proved that the things the world throws away, the broken planes, the misfit crews, the impossible missions are sometimes exactly what the world needs most. 9 men flew into the sky over Buka Island on June 16, 1943. 1 never came home. The other 8 carried that morning with them for the rest of their lives. 26 enemy fighters destroyed. Thousands of Marines saved on beaches they could see because a dying bombardier kept his cameras running. A legacy that reshaped military doctrine for generations. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These men deserve to be remembered. Subscribe so you never miss another story of forgotten heroes who changed history. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from." We read every single one. Joseph Sarnowski was 3 days from going home when he climbed into old 666 for the last time. He didn't have to go. Nobody ordered him. He went because his crew needed him. He went because that's what heroes do. They show up when it matters, even when it costs them everything. He never made it home to Pennsylvania. He never saw his wife Marie again. But because he stayed at those guns with his neck torn open and his life pouring out onto the floor of accursed bomber Marines, walked onto beaches in November 1943 and lived. That's the only medal that matters. Not the one in the glass case. The one measured in lives that didn't end. In families that stayed whole. In children who were born because their fathers came home from a beach they could see on a photograph taken by a man who chose to die at his guns rather than let his brothers fly without him. That is the story of Old 666, the cursed bomber that became immortal.